Hello, this is Nikki Going, and today in session 9 I'm going to talk to you about how to write good essays on the Crucible. So when you write essays on the Crucible, the things that we are going to cover in this session that will help you to do this are, firstly, how to argue. This is a key skill for the whole of the literature exam, but particularly for essay writing. Secondly, how to plan. Thirdly, how to actually write once you have planned. And finally, how to edit your writing before you submit it. So the first thing you need to know is how to argue. Now, a lot of people think that argument means fighting. It means being contentious. It doesn't actually, because real argument is very, very logical. And that is the real key to writing a good essay. Not only arguing, but arguing logically. So not like the Puritans in this picture. Now, argument is a skill that you can use for all sorts of things, and it's an incredibly valuable skill and important for your academic career, not only for English. So you will use argument in discursive essays. That's an essay where you discuss any topic. You write discursive essays for history, for example. You may write a discursive essay in your creative writing paper where you discuss issues such as climate change or the need for social movements. You use argument in literary essays, and literary essays are essentially discursive essays, except that they focus on a particular text, a play or a novel or a film or a poem. You use argument, obviously, for writing argumentative essays, for short answers in your literature and language exams, because the basis of writing a good short answer in a literature or language exam is that you are going to persuade the examiner that you are correct in what you are saying. And the best way to do that is to argue. And as I said, in any question, in any subject where you need to be persuasive, where you need to convince your reader or your listener of your point. So the important thing to remember about arguments is that a good argument has 3 parts. And this is an ancient and much tried and trusted formula for structuring arguments. It was actually developed by Plato thousands of years ago, and subsequently no one's come up with a better formula. So if you get to grips with this, it'll really help you, as I said, with your academics. So a good argument consists of a point, which is basically a statement that you make. That is backed up by evidence or proof. And then finally, you have an explanation which proves how your point is actually true. And I think if you think about it, if you've watched any kind of crime movies or murder mysteries, you'll see that detectives and the police, for example, use this structure when they go and present evidence in court. They make a point about the person they've arrested. You know, this person murdered Bob. They bring in evidence. They found a knife in his house. The knife had Bob's blood in it. He had already had a fight with Bob about Bob's girlfriend. The explanation, he had a motive, he had a weapon, and he was placed at the scene of the crime. Therefore, he probably murdered our character Bob. So you can see that this structure of building an argument is used outside of English. And I'm sure many of you have probably tried it out on your parents. Just think about the last time you argued to not have to wash the dishes or feed the dog or take the rubbish out. You probably presented your parents with a point, evidence, explanation, structure. So you already have the skills. Now you just need to apply them to your understanding of the Crucible. So this is an example of a point, evidence, explanation structure as applied to the Crucible. And notice that you can argue all sorts of things, and what makes an argument right is simply how well you have proved it. So you might make the point, Abigail is a cold-hearted sociopath, but your reader or your listener has got no reason to believe you until you've actually proved it. So you can see the little character on the right is thinking, well, you know, why should I believe you? So a point without evidence and explanation is just an opinion. It's not particularly persuasive. So you've got to back it up with some evidence, with some proof. Here's your evidence. Abigail drinks blood to kill Elizabeth using magic. Now you can see that your your reader is starting to get swayed. You're being fairly convincing. But you need to explain how this proves that she's a sociopath so that they really, really are thoroughly convinced. Only someone with no conscience or empathy would try to murder her lover's wife. So there you can see how your evidence that she drinks blood proves your point that she's a sociopath, because it implies that she has no conscience and no empathy. And that's why she was willing to try and murder Elizabeth. And you can see there that your listener is thinking, wow, that's got to be true. But bear in mind that there are no single correct arguments. So you could actually argue the complete opposite. You know, let's say your friend put this argument into an essay. You could argue a completely opposite point of view. And as long as you proved that argument, you too could be right and get really good marks. So here is an opposite argument that also follows the point evidence explanation structure. Abigail is just a vulnerable child defending herself. Again, this is just a point. It's simply a statement or an opinion. There is no evidence to back it up. So until it gets evidence or proof, it's not persuasive. So you can see that the reader is thinking, I don't believe you. She behaves like a sociopath. Now you've got to prove that she's just a vulnerable child defending herself. You need to find evidence in the text that will actually back that up. Those who refused to confess to witchcraft in Salem were killed. For example, Rebecca Nurse. Okay, that's fairly powerful evidence of Abigail's vulnerability. But you need to explain now how that proves your point, that she's just a vulnerable child, she was just defending herself. Abigail did not have an adult's coping skills or Rebecca's moral courage, and so she was forced into making accusations. Now you can see here I've argued something very different to Abigail is just a sociopath. But in both cases, both arguments, I've given evidence and an explanation. And so both of them are convincing arguments. So your next trick when you're going to write an essay is to use your arguments and string them together to answer an essay question. And I will get into that in a little bit more detail in a moment. But before we carry on with that, I just want to point out that the Crucible itself is a wonderful text because it is full of arguments. And one of the things you need to do is be able to unpack and analyze those arguments. So, for example, Proctor makes a classic argument when he says, you never wonder if Paris be innocent or Abigail. Here he is making a point. It's just a statement. He's got to give some evidence to back it up. So he says, were they born this morning clean as God's fingers? Vengeance is walking Salem. And of course, now we need to explain how that evidence proves his original point. No one is perfect. There are evil reasons for people testifying against their neighbors. So although Proctor doesn't make that explanation in the play, he implies it, and Hale certainly understands that as his explanation. So you can see that Proctor is using that point evidence explanation structure, and that's what Hale understands. One thing to watch out for, though, is when you use an argument, whether you're quoting an argument from a text or you're putting one together for yourself, never assume that just because there is what looks like a chain of logic, you know, you've got a statement, you've got a point, you've got evidence and you've got an explanation, and they seem to be logically linked, never assume that they are actually logically linked, because you do get what is known as fallacious arguments, false arguments, arguments that prove something that is in fact not true. Okay, so that's where you have flawed logic. And of course the Crucible is filled with flawed logic. A lot of it comes from Danforth and the court. So, for example, Danforth says, I cannot pardon these when 12 are already hanged for the same crime. That's his point. He gives the evidence of it is not just. And then, of course, the implied explanation behind that is if some people have been hanged unjustly for witchcraft, then everyone accused of witchcraft must be hanged unjustly, because otherwise this wouldn't be justice. And when you actually look at what he's implying and you write it down and unpack it, you can see that this is a fallacious argument because it's not logically sound. So just before you write an essay out, check that your arguments are in fact logical, that when you say that one thing leads us to conclude another, there is in fact a direct link and that it makes sense. So beware, not all arguments that sound logical are logical. And of course, this is one of the things that Miller satirizes throughout the Crucible, the fact that highly educated men like Danforth present very, very logical sounding arguments, and they completely beguile, to use his words, the audience in the process. And you, of course, do not want to be beguiling your marker, assuming that that's even possible. So when we think about what a discursive essay is, because that's ultimately what you're writing in a literary essay, it's important to know that it's an essay where you discuss a topic in detail before you come to a conclusion. It's important to know that depending on the topic, you can usually agree or disagree or partially agree with the given topic. So you do not have to automatically, with every topic, agree with it. Okay? You must show that you've addressed the topic in detail and thought about all aspects of the topic. A very common error that students make is they read the first half of a topic and they write about that, and they completely ignore the second half of the topic. So always go back and check, have you answered the whole question? This is very, very important. If you only answer half a question, you're unlikely to get much more than 50% in terms of your marks. Absolutely essentially, an essay is a series of arguments. It is not a summary of the text. It is not a summary of the text. So don't summarize the story. Your marker has already read this text. They've probably taught it for several years. They know the story. They don't need you to give them a summary. So the only bits of storytelling you bring into your argument is that which you are going to use for evidence. Your job is not to recap the story, it's to argue. Argue, argue, argue throughout. And if you actually look at the rubric for a literature essay, you'll see that the word argument pops up all over the place. So a literature essay is basically a discursive essay about a literary text. So for example, it would be a discursive essay in which you discuss an aspect or a theme, perhaps the imagery or the characters or part of the plot in Hamlet or the Crucible or the Life of Pi or whatever text it is that you're addressing. And then, as I said, an essay is just arguments joined together. And the point of every single argument in an essay is to prove one main point. And that main point is known as your hypothesis. Now, hypo means underlying, and thesis means idea. So you have one underlying idea. You can think of that as being the foundation of your essay. It's what your whole essay rests on. So a quick little definition for you. Hypothesis is the main idea that you need to prove in an essay. And you must not start writing your essay until you know what it is that you are trying to prove. So how do I know what I've got to prove, I hear you cry? I'll explain. So before we get to that, just remember the hypothesis, the main idea, is the main part of your introduction. It is the skeleton of your introduction. And to arrive at that hypothesis, the first thing you've got to do is analyze the topic, because the topic will give you your hypothesis. You basically take that topic and you reword it so that you've written out the main idea. You then draft your hypothesis, which forms the basis of your introduction. You plan using point evidence explanation, PEE, and a box structure essay plan. And I'll explain why you need a box structure essay plan in a moment. You write your essay out in fluent, full sentences, and then finally you edit it very carefully before you submit it. So that is your 5-step essay writing process. And if you work through those steps methodically, you cannot go wrong. So step number 1, analyze the topic to work out your hypothesis. So for example, if the topic is one of those topics that's based on a question, Is it true that one of the main causes of the witchcraft trials was the fact that the male characters consistently underestimated girl children? Support your response with detailed evidence from the text. Pick up a highlighter. Highlight the key terms. Because you want to make sure that your introduction includes all of those key ideas, and that throughout the body you are referring to those key ideas. So make sure that they stand out boldly and that they're at the forefront of your thoughts. Make sure that you understand the key terms. In an exam, if you don't understand the essay topic, I would advise you to do the contextual for that text and do the other essay topic. Never write an essay on a topic you don't understand. That way lies disaster. If you're given a choice of essay topics and you don't understand an essay topic, ask for clarity. Look up the words you don't understand, and if you still don't understand, choose another one. Okay? So make sure you understand all of the key terms. You're going to reuse them in your hypothesis, that big idea in your introduction. So underline or highlight them. So, and once you've done that, you can then rewrite your topic or your question as a sentence that's going to be the central part of your introduction. For example, it is true / not true, because at this stage I don't know, so I'm not going to commit myself, that the main cause of the witchcraft trials was male characters consistently underestimating girl children. Now, I need to think about which male characters, which girl children, because the other job that I have to do in an introduction is to tell my reader how I'm going to tackle this topic. So here goes. Such as Abigail Williams, Mercy Lewis, and Ruth Putnam. This happened because characters like Proctor, Paris, and Danforth often thought the children were too innocent and powerless to be evil. Now you're going to see that when I unpack the body of this essay, my reader can reasonably expect a paragraph on Abigail Williams, Mercy Lewis, and Ruth Putnam, or a paragraph on Proctor, Paris, and Danforth, and how they treated those three girls. But there will be a breakdown of paragraphs that looks like what I have put in the introduction, and preferably in that order. Okay, so notice key terms from the question, they've popped up again in the hypothesis. So main cause, witchcraft trials, male characters consistently underestimate girl children. I've left true, not true in red because at the moment I'm not sure which way I'm going to go. The meaning of the key terms is clear. So I've explained that by underestimating, it meant that they misunderstood the children. They thought they were innocent and powerless. And as I said, how the essay is going to be written is clear. I'm going to base my paragraphs on individual characters. And as I said, at this stage, I haven't yet decided if my statement is true or not. Now, you're probably thinking, well, how can I write an introduction when I don't know actually whether or not my statement is true? Remember, you're not writing yet. You're still planning. And you will know how you feel about your hypothesis once you've planned the body. So people are really determined that they're going to write, in the order of introduction, body, conclusion. Yes, that's correct when you're writing. But when you're planning, you don't have to start with the introduction. In fact, the introduction is the hardest paragraph because the introduction sums up what you think. And until you've planned the body, you probably don't know what you think. So if you are struggling, start with the body. More on that later. Okay, so how do you plan? Now, I recommend that you use point evidence explanation always. And a really easy way to structure is a box structure essay plan. It doesn't technically have to be boxes. You can use bullet points. But what you really need to remember is that before you ink, you need to think. Lots and lots of think before the ink. A lot of people just panic and they just write flat out. And then what happens is that they present a whole pile of ideas, some of which are relevant, some of which are not, many of which are repetitive, some of which are incorrect. And there is absolutely no order or structure. And then it's very hard for an examiner to make sense of what you're trying to say. If you plan carefully, you come across as logical, organized, and persuasive. And I would say that a good plan can make a 20 to 25% difference in the marks that you actually get. So to write a good essay, you need to plan, 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 plan some more, and then write. Now, a lot of people, when they plan, they do this woolly cloud, and then they do stalks coming off it, and they just jot down random ideas. That might be okay if you're writing a creative essay, but it really does not pan out well for a literary essay because there are a number of disadvantages. So this might help you to generate ideas, but you can see there is absolutely no logical organization there. You can't see whether or not your ideas are actually relevant. You're very likely to repeat yourself. If you look at a box structure essay plan, you can see already that there is a hierarchy, there is a structure, there is a logic here. So you can actually check how one thing is related to another. So how this works is, in the box at the top, you would put in your introduction. That's the main idea or thesis that you're trying to prove. So, for example, if your essay topic is John Proctor a tragic hero, your introduction could be something like John Proctor is a tragic hero, or John Proctor is not a tragic hero, or John Proctor is only a tragic hero in some respects because. And then you would very briefly summarize the arguments that you're going to use to prove that. Now, at this stage when you're planning, you probably don't know what the arguments are. So you actually start with your body. Now, your body is those series of point evidence explanations. And you can see that each point evidence explanation is an argument. And you have one argument per paragraph. So, for example, if you are arguing that John Proctor is a tragic hero, you might have a paragraph arguing that he starts off as a noble character that we can admire. Then you could have a paragraph arguing that he has a fatal flaw that leads to his destruction. Then you could have a paragraph arguing that before his death, he has a moment of revelation, of growth, where he realizes how wrong he's been. He comes right. He makes peace with the world. Arguably, in the Crucible, it would be the moment where he and Elizabeth forgive each other and he decides that he wants to live. And then the final point about a tragic hero is that he dies a terrible death that seems to be out of all proportion for the crime or the fault that he has in him. And arguably, John Proctor being hanged because he refuses to lie is a really violent and terrible death. So there you can see I've got 4 arguments. Each one is based around a characteristic of a tragic hero. They all seem to suggest that John Proctor is a tragic hero. And they would then all reinforce my main idea or hypothesis. And then your final job is to link your arguments together, which I'll explain to you in a little bit more detail. And then you round your essay off with your conclusion. And you can think of your conclusion as being like an advert. So the conclusion is where you summarize for your reader, for your marker, the main reasons that your thesis in your introduction is correct. So a good way to think of an essay plan is the introduction is the menu or the roadmap. You tell me where you're going to go. The body of the essay is the meat, it's the main meal, it's the content. And then the conclusion is the advert. You know, this was totally wonderful, and it was absolutely right because. So if we look at our first essay topic, the introduction, as I said, it is true or perhaps not true that the main cause of the witchcraft trials was the male characters consistently underestimating girl children, such as Abigail Williams, Mercy Lewis, and Ruth Putnam. This happened because characters like Proctor, Paris, and Danforth often thought that children were too innocent and powerless to be evil. Notice how every single paragraph, every single argument must prove that hypothesis in the introduction. So my first argument, John Proctor underestimates Abigail at the start of the play. There's my point. Evidence. In Act 1, he's convinced that her dancing in the forest was just sport, fun, and he calls her child when he ends their romantic relationship. Explanation: John Proctor does not realize that Abigail is capable of using witchcraft to murder his wife, and that she slept with him as a mature woman who hoped to replace his wife. Now I have to ask myself, is my point, evidence, and explanation logically linked? And does that argument prove that the underestimation of Abigail Williams led to the witchcraft trials? And I think it does. So therefore, it's a valid argument. I'm going to keep it. So when you plan the body of your essay, as I said, if you are stuck with the hypothesis, you're not sure what you think, start with the body of the essay. And your start can be as simple as thinking of examples that apply to the essay topic, because those examples are your evidence. From your evidence, you can work out your points and your explanation. If you're not in an exam and you're writing the essay in class or at home, you can actually look through your book very carefully and look for events or quotes that are relevant to your topic. And that will lead you to your points and to your explanation, and that will help you to work out what you feel about the hypothesis. As you find relevant information and evidence, fill in the boxes. So as I said, you can start in the middle of your essay. You can start in the body. You don't have to start at the top and work down. Again, don't summarize the plot. Just argue throughout. That's what you're getting marks for. And in fact, when essays are marked normally, what a teacher will do is they will bracket all the storytelling. They will bracket everything that doesn't answer the question. And then they ignore that and they mark what's left. So you need to think carefully about how much is left once the teacher has got rid of all the storytelling and all the stuff that doesn't answer the question. Right. Each argument or paragraph needs to flow or link naturally to the next. It's very disturbing for a reader when you jump violently from one argument to another and there's no connection between them. So an argument is P-E-E and an essay is P-E-E-L, P-E-E-L, because the L stands for link. So it's P-E-E, link to P-E-E, link to P-E-E, and you put in as many arguments as you need to prove your hypothesis conclusively. So for example, we talked through the argument about Abigail, and that can be linked in the wording of your point for your second argument. Reverend Paris also underestimates Abigail. So you can see how that links to the idea in the previous paragraph, the explanation. John Proctor does not realize that Abigail is capable of using witchcraft to murder his wife. So argument 2, Reverend Paris also underestimates Abigail. It's just in red so that you can see that the point also forms a link. The evidence in Act 4, she takes him by surprise when she runs away and steals his life-saving from his strongbox. Explanation: even though Reverend Paris knows that Abigail is completely dishonest, he does not predict that she will be able to escape from Salem when she realizes that her life is in danger. So you can see how one argument flows logically into another. And of course, because these are two different paragraphs, you would leave a line between them so that your reader can clearly see the divisions between your arguments. So before you write your essay out in full, have a single page box structure or bullet point plan and check your logic. And you can do this with a two-way check. So if you start at the top of your essay plan and add "we know this because" between each box going up, the essay should make sense. And if you start at the bottom and repeat the process, the essay should still make sense. So whether you work down or work up, the links between point, evidence, explanation, and between arguments and the hypothesis should all still make sense. So if we have a look here, I would check that my point is linked to my evidence and is linked to my explanation logically in argument 1. And then I would ask myself, does this prove my hypothesis in the introduction? Is my PEE linked logically in argument 2? Does this prove my hypothesis in the introduction? And ditto for paragraph 3 and paragraph 4. I can also work the other way around. My main idea or thesis is true because of argument 1, argument 2, argument 3, and argument 4. And of course, before I start writing my essay, I would ask myself, are argument 1, 2, 3, and 4 actually in the best order? If they're not, don't redo your entire essay plan. It's a complete waste of time. Just renumber them so that you know what order you're going to write your paragraphs in. And I would suggest that the best order usually is to write your paragraphs in the same order as the events happened in the play. In other words, chronological order, time order. So, if your evidence for argument 3 comes from Act 1 and your evidence for argument 1 comes from Act 3, you should seriously consider swapping them around so that you work through the play in the order of events. You might have a good reason not to, in which case don't. But unless you have a good reason, it's usually safest to stick to a time order of events. Okay? So, and then you link each paragraph with a linking sentence. So that's your peel. And then finally, your conclusion, you're basically advertising the main reasons that your thesis in your introduction was correct. So once you've structured your argument, you've got a much better idea of what your hypothesis is. So you might now know the witchcraft trials did happen because men did underestimate children. Or maybe you've decided that wasn't the main reason. Or maybe it was only part of the reason. Whatever your decision is, you need to make that clear in your introduction. When you've planned the body, check that whether or not your introduction should be adjusted. What sometimes happens is people start off thinking one thing, they plan all their arguments in the body, and they actually come to a different conclusion, but then they don't adjust their introduction, so they'll end up contradicting themselves. So just make sure that whatever you're arguing in the body, that's what you're saying in the introduction and the conclusion. It should all match. Never contradict yourself. It's the equivalent of shooting yourself in both feet. Okay. So there was our introduction, and we're saying in this case it's true. The main cause of the witchcraft trials was the male characters consistently underestimating girls such as Abigail, Mercy, and Ruth. And it's because people like Proctor, Paris, and Danforth often thought that children were too innocent and powerless to be evil. So you can see there, my opinion is clear. I'm saying it's true. I have defined terms where the meaning is not absolutely clear. So you can see that what I mean by underestimating, not knowing what they're capable of. The introduction has also acted like a menu or a roadmap. You can see that I'm going to deal with my essay on a character-by-character basis. And it's not too long. Your introduction should only be 2 or 3 sentences because you're going to get most of your marks from the body of your essay. So don't waffle on in your introduction. Okay, so then you need to show that you've proved your main point from the introduction in your conclusion. As I said, your conclusion is like an advertisement. Briefly summarize the main arguments. Don't include any material that you have not dealt with in the body of your essay. So if you have a fabulous idea while you're writing your essay out in neat, go back and adjust the body, make sure that you've argued it in the body, make sure that you've mentioned it in the introduction, and then you can put it in the conclusion. If you just put it in the conclusion, it just looks like you're disorganized, and don't contradict yourself. Conclusion again, 2 or 3 sentences at the most. So here's a sample conclusion. The male characters in the Crucible are so used to having the most power in the social hierarchy in Salem that they cannot imagine that anyone with less power than them could possibly deceive or manipulate them. Characters such as Abigail Williams, Mercy Lewis, and Ruth Putnam are able to manipulate men like Proctor, Paris, and Danforth because these men are blinded by their own power, arrogance, and assumptions that women and children are too weak to act independently. So you can see I haven't simply rewritten my introduction, but I have emphasized why what I was saying in my introduction is correct. You're now ready, now that you've done your plan, to write your essay out in full, provided you've done a couple of checks. So make sure that every single paragraph refers clearly back to the question, because sometimes you get so enthused about the play or the book that you're writing about that you actually start writing about something that might be very true and very interesting but isn't actually answering the question. And you need to highlight to the reader that you're still answering the question. So don't repeat the question word for word in every paragraph, but imply something of the question so that the reader knows that you're still on track. Keep rereading that question. Make sure that you've answered the whole question. Remember, don't fall into the trap of only answering the first half. Make sure that the proof that you're giving, your quotes and your evidence, is actually correct. Double check. Make sure that you're not repeating yourself. So you shouldn't have the same argument just phrased in a different way 3 times, because you're only going to get marks for it once and you're wasting words. And your essay length is 400 to 450 words, which sounds like a lot, but with a dense play like the Crucible, where there's loads to say, it's actually very difficult to get all the arguments that you want to get into that 400 words. So you don't have the word space for repetition or waffle. As I said, make sure paragraphs are in a logical order, and it's a good idea to decide beforehand what sort of order are you going for. And this depends entirely on the topic. So you could go for a chronological order. So if your topic is one that seems to be quite plot-based, then a chronological order would work. So, for example, if you had a topic like discuss the way in which Abigail becomes increasingly evil through the course of the play, it makes sense to start at the beginning and work your way towards the end. But you might decide that for a certain topic, it's better to go with themes. So, for example, your topic could be something like reputation is the currency of power in Salem. And then you might decide that you're going to do one paragraph on a binary worldview and how this results in a tension between reputation and integrity. You might do another paragraph on how characters without integrity manipulated the power of a good reputation in order to gain power. You might do another paragraph on how characters who had integrity lost all their power and lost their good reputation because they refused to confess to the lie of witchcraft. So there you are basically doing a paragraph around aspects of the theme, and it's not necessarily in chronological order. You could also arrange your essay in terms of characters if the topic suits that. So, for example, the topic we were looking at, where we said male characters consistently underestimate female characters, you could then have separate paragraphs on each male character or separate paragraphs on each female character. Depends how you want to do it. As I said, if you realize in your planning that you want to change your paragraph order, just use arrows or numbers to do that. Don't spend hours rewriting your plan. You're not going to get marks for your plan, but paradoxically, if you don't plan, you're going to lose a lot of marks because what you write will be an academic mess. So it's important to plan, but don't worry about the copper plate handwriting. And it doesn't matter if you've got lots of arrows and stars and colors and things in it. Keep planning until you're sure about all of these things. So you've got to have a very clear idea of exactly what you're going to do before you start writing. And the funny thing is, if you've got a clear plan and you've worked it all out in advance, actually writing it doesn't take that long. Now, just a couple of little notes on how you structure this. Okay. You're going to take your plan and you're going to write your essay out in full, fluent sentences. So in your plan, you don't have to use full sentences. You can just use bullet points and sentence fragments. As long as you know what's going on, that's fine. When you write your essay out, you do not have to always write each argument in the order of point, evidence, explanation. You know, if you think about it, when you eat a cake, You really don't care whether the milk or the eggs or the flour went in first, as long as your cake's got all the ingredients. And it's the same thing with an argument. Sometimes your argument will read better if you start with a really interesting quote or an interesting bit of evidence, or you wrap your explanation and your point up together. That's absolutely fine, as long as you've got all three ingredients. And in fact, if you go point, evidence, explanation over and over again, it can make your essay quite boring. So here's an example of a paragraph that's written in evidence, point, explanation order, and it actually reads beautifully. So we start with evidence. Giles Corey swore an affidavit that Thomas Putnam was killing his neighbours for their land when he tried to present evidence that the witchcraft trials were flawed in Act 3. The point you're trying to make there is, therefore it is obvious that greed is one of the factors that leads to the witchcraft trials in Salem. And the explanation, Giles Corey explains that Thomas Putnam gets his daughter Ruth to accuse rich landowners of witchcraft, and when they're found guilty, their land is auctioned by the state and Putnam buys it at a low price. You can see it's a perfectly persuasive, well-written argument, even though it's not in PEE order. Okay, so here it's actually in EPE order, but it doesn't matter. Now, just a little note on evidence. When you present evidence, a common error that students make is they make a point and then they just drop a quote in and they don't explain anything about the quote. So they'll say something like, Thomas Putnam, Giles Corey swears that Thomas Putnam is dishonest. And then new sentence, this man is killing his neighbours for their land. And then new sentence, Danforth won't accept this evidence. Now, you can see that you haven't actually made the logical links there that make me connect my point, evidence, and explanation, or even that explain the evidence in a way that I can understand. So whenever you present evidence, you want to make sure that you also talk about the who, the what, the why, and the when of the event that you're describing, because evidence is ultimately events in the plot. And also remember that in a text like the Crucible, things change all the time and they change really fast. So it's important that you say where and when in the play you're talking about and who you are talking about. So for example, here, I've said make sure you mention the who. So the who here is Giles Corey and Thomas Putnam. The what, swore an affidavit. The why, killing his neighbours for their land. And the when he tried to present evidence that the witchcraft trials were flawed in Act 3. So here I can see from the evidence exactly which point in the play I'm talking about, who's talking, what they're talking about, and why they are even saying what they are saying. And it means that my evidence makes sense and it's going to link clearly with my point and my explanation. Now, you'll sometimes hear teachers say, oh, you must embed your quote, which sounds very posh and very scary, but it's not actually. It just means make your quote part of a sentence. Don't have it sitting stoksielalien with nothing around it that actually makes sense. So put quotation marks around it and actually put it inside a sentence, as I've done here. But that demands some grammatical flick-flacks, and maybe you're not up to the kind of verbal acrobatics that are required to embed a quote in a sentence. So an easier thing to do, and it's just as valid, and you're less likely to get the grammar wrong, is to simply summarize the evidence in your own words. You do not have to quote. You do not have to quote. I know there are people that sit down and learn reams of quotes before exams, and I think it's actually a bit of a waste of time. It is quite impressive to drop some quotes in there, but you certainly do not have to quote. And the problem with quotes is you're meant to get them word for word perfect, which is a lot of stress to put yourself under in exam conditions. So you can just say something like, Putnam was murdering his neighbours for his land according to Giles Corey. Now there I haven't used quotation marks because I haven't quoted Giles Corey's exact words, but the evidence is just as good, just as convincing, and much easier to actually write out. Okay, so some useful words that you can use in the different parts of your essay. In your introduction, if you use these phrases, it makes it sound like you are an academic, that you know what you're talking about, you're using appropriate language. So you can use phrases like it can be said, or it can be argued that, whatever, because, and then you lead into your reasons. The statement, and then you get your statement from your topic, is true or not true because, or the idea, theory, proposition that whatever is true and can be proved or disproved because. So those are phrases that you can use in your introduction. When you're making points, you can use phrases like it can be said that, or seen that, or it's evident that, or in the text XYZ becomes clear or obvious or apparent. So you can see I'm just giving you some vocab. To introduce evidence, phrases like this is obvious because, or for example, or this can be proved by the fact that, or this is evident when, or a good example is. And then for your explanation, therefore is a good one. Therefore the evidence suggests, or therefore it's obvious, or from this example it can be proved. Just notice that in all of these words and phrases, I have not once used personal pronouns. I don't use I or we or you. So you can use he or she because you're talking about characters, but you don't use I or we or you because I and we is you, the writer, and it's assumed that everything in your essay is your opinion. So don't say I think or I am going to write an essay about. Makes you sound like a complete amateur. And don't say you, because you is your marker, and your marker is a teacher, and teachers hate being told what to do or what to think. So never use I, we, or you in your essay. And then finally, for some good words for conclusions, as illustrated, it is clear, it is obvious that, and then you would put in your main thesis, or it is not, or true, or it's partially true. So those are some of the phrases that you can use in your writing. Once you've written your essay out, you need to reread it, because often what happens is your brain is going much faster than your hands. So you will skip words, you will skip phrases, you might put in misspellings, your grammar might be very convoluted, and then it's difficult for the reader to actually understand what you're saying. So you want to go back and you want to edit, and you want to check that you are using fairly short sentences with one idea per sentence. And the funny thing about essay writing is the more complicated the ideas are that you're explaining, the shorter your sentences need to be. Complicated language is not an indication of a good writer. Remember that your main job here is communication, so don't overcomplicate. Things you need to check. Did you include everything from your plan? And if you chose to leave something out, was there a good reason for you leaving it out? You know, it's fine to leave something out if halfway through writing you realized that actually that's not such a good point, or I've already said that, or it's not very relevant. Then it's fine to leave it out. But don't just skip something because you forgot. Are your paragraphs in a correct and logical order? Did you refer back to the question, however subtly, at least once per paragraph? Did you avoid storytelling? Really, really important. Did you argue throughout? Have you got point, evidence, explanation linked beautifully together like beads on a necklace to prove that hypothesis in the introduction? Also check, did you put your evidence in context? So did you address the who, what, when, why of your evidence? Did you embed your quotes in grammatically correct sentences? It's very important that you write in formal academic English. So I have read essays. I remember one about Hamlet that started off with, this bloke procrastinates more than the average guy going to school. By the time I got to Act 3, I was so bored I could have cried. By the time I got 2/3 of the way through that essay, I was so entertained I was laughing. But that writer didn't get a particularly good mark because his language was completely inappropriate for what he was writing. So you want to use formal academic English because you are writing as a scholar and you are writing for a teacher. So you want to avoid colloquial language. That's things like so, well, yeah, no, fine. You don't want to say things like John Proctor's like a terrible guy and he's like so abusive to Abigail it makes me sick. That may be true, but you need to phrase it in a far better way. So it's something like John Proctor is definitely a misogynist would work, as opposed to he's a revolting bloke. You also want to avoid contractions. Remember, contractions is when you take two words and you glue them together with an apostrophe. So instead of saying can't, say cannot. Instead of saying wouldn't, say would not. Didn't, did not. Okay? Avoid slang. Definitely avoid swearing, unless you are quoting a character. Then you can swear to your heart's content. But in your personal capacity, you don't swear. You should be writing in the present tense. The posh name for that is literary present. But basically it means that when you talk about characters, you use is and are, not was and did, unless it doesn't make sense. Okay? But usually you use the present tense. So you say things like, John Proctor is a misogynistic character. Even though we know that by the end of the play he's dead, and he's obviously in the past tense once he's dead, you refer to him in the present tense throughout your essay, unless it's not logical. Once you've written this, you need to edit your spelling and your grammar carefully. And if you're not writing for an exam, because obviously you can't do this in an exam, but if you're writing at home, it's a good idea to actually read your essay out loud and find someone to read it to. And if you see that look on their face, like, then you know that the way you phrased something doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So read it out loud and listen. And often you'll hear grammar errors because it is difficult to read something that hasn't been written with correct grammar. And it should make sense to the person you're reading it to, even if they haven't read the play. Also look at, is your work neatly presented? Now, a lot of people in exams get very hung up on having perfect handwriting, and then they don't finish their essay. Please, 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 please do not write your essay out in neat and then rewrite it, changing maybe 2 words. This is a total waste of time. Spend most of your time planning and then just write it once. If you then need to make corrections, just cross out neatly and do your corrections above the crossing out. In your matric final exams, you will not lose marks. You will not lose marks for crossing out and making corrections, as long as the examiner can figure out what you're saying without going mad in the process. It's absolutely fine. But just remember that you want your essay to be readable. They shouldn't have to do decoding in order to figure out what's going on. So that's as neat as it needs to be. It needs to be readable and relatively easy to understand. But then you might be asking yourself, what happens if I don't have enough time for all this elaborate planning in an exam? Okay, as I said, don't write huge, long, full sentences. You're not writing your essay out in full and then rewriting it. Just put down bullet points that are long enough so that you know what you mean. So that when you come to that bit of your essay that you're writing out in full, you know what you're going to do next. So here I've just given you an example of a bullet point plan. And this is probably the one time in your English exams and your English career where it's actually fine to use cell phone text language, because it's a good form of abbreviation, and if you know what it means, then it's done its job. So for example, P1, Abby manip Proctor. I know that means Abigail manipulates Proctor. That's the point I'm going to make in paragraph 1. Pretends to be little girl, hopeless in love. Okay, my evidence, she pretends when she talks to Proctor in Act 1 and she's trying to seduce him again, that she's just a vulnerable, innocent little girl, and she emphasizes how hopelessly in love she is. That's the expanded version of it, but I can get that from those brief abbreviations. And then a little quote, "Give me a soft word, John." But I've just written a soft word because that's going to remind me that's the quote I want to use. And my explanation, he doesn't think she's cruel, because he just sees her as a child. He just sees her as a woman that he once loved and that loves him back. And then if you look at paragraph 2, Abby manip Paris. Okay, so now we moved on from Proctor onto Paris. And again, I've just bulleted very briefly my evidence. Now, you might not know what that evidence means. It doesn't matter because this is my essay. I need to know what that means. And as long as I unpack that when I write my essay out in full, the examiner will know what I mean. Okay, and you can see that with probably 30 words, I've planned 3 paragraphs and 3 major arguments, which would be the bulk of the body of my essay. And that probably would have taken me about 3 minutes. So you don't have to write tons and tons and tons in your planning, as long as what you write is enough to trigger your memory and enough to give you a clear structure. And then you're thinking, but what if I read this exam topic and I just have no idea? What do I do? Okay, as I said, start with the body. Think of evidence and examples that tie into the topic, and from there you'll probably be able to work out points and explanations. But the biggest single way to avoid getting into that nightmare scenario is actually practice beforehand. You don't want to be sitting in your final matric exam trying to think of arguments in response to an essay topic that you have never even considered before. Ideally, when you walk into that exam and you read that topic, you need to think, oh, I've got this argument, this argument, this argument, this argument, and you know you've made those arguments before. So how do you get those arguments into your head in advance? Well, practice using point evidence explanation when you talk about the play in class. Whenever your teacher asks you a question or something comes up for discussion, use that point evidence explanation structure. And your teacher will encourage it probably by saying things like, can you prove what you're saying? Or why do you say that? She's asking for evidence and an explanation. And then when you answer practice questions, ask yourself, have I used point evidence explanation? Have I linked those things together logically? Good idea to look at past papers, for example, on the WCD website. And again, do bullet point plans. And before I go into a matric final exam, I would plan at least 5 topics. Just bullet point plans. I will never write them out in full, but at least I know that I've thought about at least 5 topics before I go into the exams. And if you think about that, the average essay's probably got 3 or 4 arguments. If you've done 5 topics, you've got 20 arguments there that you can customize according to the topic you get in the exam. And then you can just adjust those topics. You're not coming at this cold. And then a good way to think of topics or how you're going to approach topics is if you think about the previous 8 sessions we've had on the Crucible, the top of all those slides, there were themes that come through the Crucible again and again and again. And most of your topics are going to be based around themes, and you can certainly use those themes to answer questions. So review those themes, go over them, and use them as a basis. Practice making up your own questions around the themes and thinking of arguments that answer them, because that will also help you to formulate what you think of the play. And then finally, my best advice. You can go onto the internet and use various study guides and sites to do sort of crash courses on your texts. But I don't think there is any substitute for sitting down with a pencil and a cup of tea or whatever it is that you like to drink and rereading that play very, very carefully and making notes as you go along. And if you hate reading, get an audio text and listen to it. Or watch the play, better still, because it is, after all, a play. It's meant to be watched. And that will help you to generate your own ideas, your own views, and better still, the ability to actually support and substantiate them. Now, in my next session, I'm going to unpack how you answer contextual questions. But the reason that I started with how you answer essay questions is because, as I said, essay questions are based on argument. And you needed to know that argument structure for essay questions. And you can use that exact argument structure when you answer your contextual questions. So that will be the subject of the final session, which comes next, how to answer contextual questions, which are very often based on argument. Thank you.